Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Really nice to see you all. Just to introduce myself, I'm Mark Hirons. I'm a senior researcher based at the ECI in the School of Geography, and I've been involved with Agile more or less since it started, working partly both on a sprint 3, the one on scaling up nature-based solutions, but also I have this role as a kind of program-level researcher looking at questions of what's the role of universities in this space, how do we evaluate and learn from the experiences, and kind of how do we connect with broader society, as well as kind of think about science policy connections. And so I found this morning a kind of fascinating bit of a stock take on where we're at, some of the activities we've been doing. Hopefully you've got a good flavour for that as well with the posters downstairs. The plan for this afternoon is to kind of switch our minds and look forward a bit, and kind of what's next. And the idea here is to kind of try and foster a very generative discussion. For those of us who are involved in Agile, there'll be lots of things that are relevant, but hopefully everyone here is interested in this space, science and policy and society, and how these things connect. So we're going to go, for various reasons, with a more dynamic kind of panel this afternoon. So we'll have, we've got 3 great panelists who will offer relatively short reflections on what they've heard this morning and connect that to their own work. We have John, James, and Will. I'll introduce them as they come up. And then, unfortunately, Jessica Umakuchi, who works on Inclusive Net Zero, can't be here. Her son's not well. So we're going to trial this idea of having kind of a fishbowl panel. I've seen this work relatively successfully. It does require a bit of audience participation. But the idea is that we can't have Jess, which is really sad, but we'll have a spare chair on the panel. And instead of asking your question in a kind of audience panel kind of a way, I'm going to invite you up. If you have a question, I'm going to invite you onto the stage to ask your question and have a bit of dialogue with the panel. And then if you have for those of you with questions, come and kind of hover near that chair, and the person will hopefully take the hint that somebody else wants to come onto the panel, and then we can switch people around, and that way, hopefully that will bring a bit of dynamism and a bit more diversity to the panel as well. So that's the plan, but we'll start with the kind of reflections. We're going to start kind of with John, who's been involved with Agile, and then draw in some kind of other expertise as well. So if you join me up here, John. I don't think one of these is working. So yeah, John's a postdoctoral researcher in the biology department and has been involved with Agile Sprint 3 and is also involved with a new sprint. And the idea, I think you said you wanted to reflect a bit on your experiences so far and kind of how you kind of see things evolving as the work progresses. So.
Yeah, exactly. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. Really enjoyed the day so far. So as Mark said, I'm John Lynch. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative in the Department of Biology. And yeah, I was gonna quite informally talk through some of my reflections of having been on Agile Sprint 3, which was scaling up nature-based solutions in the UK, and then talk a bit about the mini sprint that I've just started leading about a month ago now. So there's a poster downstairs with the others, which we already had lots of great conversations about. So I'll talk a little bit about the science of the project, but actually a bit more about the kind of administrative and vision side of getting it set up. But first off, in terms of where we are in finished with this, pending a few more papers to get written up on the Sprint 3. So my experience in that was as a postdoctoral researcher, so 50% of my time was on that Sprint 3. Was incredible to work on that project, and I think we achieved an absolutely massive amount. So this was one of the biggest sprints, so how do we scale up nature-based solutions in the UK is a big question. In hindsight, maybe slightly too big for a 1-year project, but part of the Agile learning experience. So I was mainly focused on land use, environmental modelling, and also looking at the emerging funding options for nature-based solutions in the UK. So looking back, I'm kind of astounded at how much we did within that 1 year, and even some of the outputs that we got out within it. So just for my bit of the research, we coordinated a submission for the government soil health inquiry in January. We put out a big report on what a carbon code for seagrass might look like, and then some accompanying documents kind of bringing out the key messages. We'll have a website launching soon that will have a kind of funding finder tool so that land use practitioners can see what might help them get nature-based solutions set up. And all these things, we kind of did the research, got the outputs together, and more or less delivered them within the sprint. So that's extremely positive reflection. Where we're still catching up a little bit is converting those into academic papers. So I think we always knew it was going to be tight to work in that timeline. But for me as a postdoc, I suppose, as much as we've been talking about the importance of these wider impacts in the policy pool that we do, and I do genuinely think, and through feedback I've received, that some of the kind of policy briefs, the government submissions, have been impactful. I do have in the back of my mind whether they're kind of viewed as quite a bit lesser on your CV or in fellowship applications and so on compared to an academic paper. So I'm very interested later maybe discussing about that, about how do we, when we're applying for things or putting our CVs together, how do we really sell those extra bits of work that don't fit in with the standard academic publications. So that's where we are on that sprint, and yeah, it's a busy time getting them written, but I think we've done a lot, and hopefully by the end of this year we'll have the papers submitted as well. So as I said, I was a postdoc with half of my time on that sprint, and partly because well, I'll take a step back. So my background is in agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and modeling their impacts on the climate. So a lot of the work I was doing about land use pathways, ways to reduce agricultural emissions built on that. A kind of ongoing frustration I have, or research opportunity, depending if you want to frame it in a positive or negative way, is seeing that there's big uncertainties in many of these agricultural and land use emissions. So very few agricultural and environmental emissions come from direct measurement. It's mainly modeling where you take your activity, so how many cows do you have, how much peatland area do you have, and what conditions in, and then multiply it by a sort of emissions factor of tons of methane coming off per hectare. And this is actually how most of the government's emissions reporting is done for its national inventory reports, and hence is what leads into the kind of expectations for what emissions are going to be that have to be balanced to get to net zero. And I've seen from the way the inventories are developed that there's kind of a rush to get the inventories out every year, and everyone knows there's quite a big spread of the uncertainties, but no one really has the capacity to dig into them a bit more. So when the call for kind of new agile projects came out, and especially this potential for mini sprints that were a bit smaller in scale, this kind of immediately clicked with me that this was a perfect chance to do that kind of research that had an immediate and a longer term policy use in terms of contributing to national emissions inventories, but was, especially compared to the previous sprint maybe, was a much smaller scale with a narrower, more specific question. So I had this kind of scientific question in mind. Through the other sprint and other work, I'd been in conversations with the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland and the Wildlife Trusts in the UK. So I kind of informally talked through the idea of the mini sprint and pitched this project to them. They were both keen. So from a kind of combined scientific understanding of how can we better get a handle on these emissions uncertainties and use that knowledge to have kind of no regret management plans and help achieve their net zero objectives. And then developed some more specific case study ideas, which we're still refining them, but it's essentially going to be questions about methane emissions and evaluation for Northern Ireland, and various habitat restoration for the wildlife trusts. So I put in an expression of interest at the start of the summer for this mini sprint, having flagged up these as two potential stakeholder co-creators. We were approved from the expression of interest stage, so then we took it forward to full project creation. So it was for a bit of my time, a full-time research assistant to do a desk-based work, looking into the kind of IPCC equations for how these emissions are estimated, doing some systematic literature review to see if we could replace them with any newer values in the literature, and then deploying them in our case studies that would be hopefully of direct use for our stakeholders. And it was, as well as just being a useful scientific question, it's really good timing to help with our stakeholder needs. So in Northern Ireland, there's their own Climate Change Act kind of requires specific consideration to biogenic greenhouse gas emissions, and DERA are trying to plan out the agriculture and land use route to net zero. So that's being done as we speak, so hopefully the first half of our sprint will contribute to that. And then at the Wildlife Trusts, end of next year and early the following is when they want to lay out their institutional net zero pathway. So over the course of this mini sprint that will run until next September, hopefully we'll narrow down some of their uncertainties, and then they can build on that to get their route to net zero. So that was a kind of clear policy pull and relevance for our stakeholders. We had lots of support from the Agile Engine Room team, co-creating, quite genuinely co-creating. So I had the kind of scientific framework in mind, but we were very open to what specific needs would be helpful for them, and we will continue developing them as the project goes on. And I think it was late summer we then submitted that full proposal. That was confirmed, I think, September kind of time. And then amazingly rapid turnaround from getting that accepted to actually starting the project about a month ago. So just to highlight how quick that was, we had final okay on the project at the beginning of September, and then we properly started it, Hannah will know, sometime in October, I've forgotten the dates, but I think it was literally 5 or 6 weeks between getting the letter of confirmation and then starting it and employing our research assistant. And this is kind of an unimaginable time frame for any of us who are used to the normal kind of funding application and waiting to hear back. That was not without challenges. We did as much as we could to line up the admin between the Agile OMS, and I'm in the Department of Biology, so we tried to get all the groundwork there ready early. There were still a few things that we had to delay or tweak as we went on, but it was still amazing how quickly we could get it together. I'll skip over most of the actual project side just to finally give a bit more of kind of personal reflection from my career development perspective as well. So I'm super excited about actually doing the science and hopefully addressing some of those questions that I highlighted. But also I've been a postdoc for a number of years in the stage now of applying for fellowships and other longer term positions. And we'll have to wait and see, but I think that being involved in Sprint 3, but now especially leading this mini sprint, including writing the proposal, is a kind of really unique opportunity to develop and lead a project as an early career researcher. So we're always encouraged to contribute to proposals, grant applications, but we're actually, as a postdoc, I always find you're in a bit of a bind because you're very constrained in how much freedom you can be given. So if you're on a fixed term contract, for example, you can't be a principal investigator or a named co-investigator. You can be a named postdoc, but that obviously has a bit less weight and sort of doesn't necessarily reflect how much you may have contributed to the proposal. But this mini sprint is a kind of fantastic chance to write a proposal and lead it and be recognized as leading it, while avoiding some of the more limiting administrative constraints from the funders and from departmental contract arrangements. So yeah, really exciting to have this kind of rapid turnaround on the science, and I hope also a new way of kind of developing proposals and getting different type of researcher at a different stage in their career to kind of be recognised as leading them. So yeah, that was a quick overview of where I am with the sprint, and looking forward to the questions, but also please come and see me and tea and coffee. I'll be next to my poster again if you want to learn more specifics. Thank you.
Super, thanks very much, John. It's really nice to hear about how, from kind of a different perspective, someone who's really been on the front line of Agile, how things are kind of playing out. As you know, as with any large project, a whole range of experiences, but I think one of the things that excites me about Agile is trying to do things differently and innovate in various ways, and it's kind of really interesting to hear about that. I'm going to propose that we kind of hold questions just so that we kind of build up some enthusiasm for coming up onto the stage. So if you have a question, then hold it in mind and be ready to come up shortly. But before we do that, I'll kind of turn next to James Robson, who's based in the Department for Education and is the director of SCOPE, S-K-O-P-E, which stands for, my first attempt at it is Skills, Knowledge, and Organizational Performance.
Perfect.
Yeah. He'll talk a bit more about his work, and it's kind of a bit of a step back from Agile, but still kind of largely Oxford-based kind of reflections on this question of doing science policy, particularly with your kind of broad range of projects you've been involved with, James. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me here. It's been really, really interesting to hear about all of the Agile projects and look at the posters and hear about the sprints. And I think be part of the conversation around really rethinking how we as an institution and we as researchers do policy work. I think it's a really exciting space to be. And what I want to do, I think, today is talk a bit about the work of SCOPE, the centre that I run, because we're really policy focused. We do a lot of policy work with a whole range of government departments. And I think there are probably synergies, overlaps, really interesting things that we do that relate to the work of Agile. And so I'll reflect on some of the stuff that we've done. I think I'll highlight probably particularly some of the challenges that we've experienced in working within the policy space. And then I'll maybe touch on a few, I think, opportunities that maybe exist here. But to start off with, I should probably say a little bit more about what SCOPE is. So the Centre for Skills, Knowledge and Organisational Performance, based in the Department of Education. SCOPE was originally an ESRC-funded centre, so we got 3 tranches of centre funding, and then transitioned into a self-sustaining centre where we run a portfolio of research projects to essentially keep our research staff going. We've got a number of academic staff, a number of research staff, and we have a wide range of projects, currently 11 at the moment. The work that we really do is focused on the political economy of education and training systems. That's very broad, of course. That covers a huge range of areas. Where we particularly focus is on tertiary education, so looking at further education, higher education, adult education, and all of the associated work related to research and innovation as well that's embodied within those sorts of systems. We take a broad approach, as I said, looking particularly at systems thinking, organizations, and individuals. So thinking about systems, we look at tertiary education systems in holistic terms, engaging with complexity, but thinking particularly about how they relate with other systems, so the economy particularly. We look at the relationship between education and training and skills formation, productivity, changing nature of work, how our education and training organizations and institutions can supply skills for a changing economy, a regenerative economy. We also look at the relationship between education and training and ecological systems, so thinking about the role that education has to play, or skills formation has to play, in the climate crisis, in a just transition, looking particularly at things like green skills. We've looked at green skills in relation to agriculture, working closely with DEFRA on this. We've looked at green skills in relation to construction, and have a broad range of agendas in this area, and have recently set up an education and training for the Climate Hub to bring together interdisciplinary researchers thinking about these issues and looking at this nexus between our schooling and university systems and climate issues. At the organisational level, we think about organisational performance, the ways in which education and training organisations behave, respond to bigger issues, engage with policy. All of these sorts of issues take place at this level. Again, we've got a number of different projects looking at this kind of behaviour and these kinds of approaches, including things like research culture, research and innovation culture within organisations. And then the individual level, we're really looking at sort of the formation and deployment of skills for individuals in a variety of different contexts, as well as educational outcomes, where people go, what people do, how they navigate life in relation to the education and training that they've received. So, as I said, across all of these areas, we work really closely with policymakers to look at systems, organisations, and individuals. And I think underpinning the core of our work is a theory around the policy process. So before we can even start talking about how we influence policy, I think you need to really get to grips with how policy works, how the policy process works, and looking at that from a theoretical perspective. So I think we can talk about the policy process in two main ways, either conceptualized as a linear process where policy is made, usually centrally, it's transmitted to different contexts, and then it's implemented within those contexts. I think this works really well for statist approaches, statist models of governance. That's not, we do work with some international governments who do employ and deploy this model, but that's not really the model that we experience of policy making, the policy process in countries like the UK, which takes, I think, a much more cyclical version. So having a cyclical understanding of the policy process is, I think, core to a lot of the work that we do in scope. And by cyclical, I think what we're getting at is the idea that the policy process is messy. It involves iteration and a whole range of different policy actors involved in translating and implementing that policy in a sort of unique way, which then goes back into the formational process. I think taking that stance highlights that there's a variety of different policy actors within the policy cycle. And that means that if you're wanting to have policy impact and engage in policy work, there's a big range of potential people and potential levels in that cyclical process that you can engage in. So it doesn't always need to be going straight to central government to engage in policy work. You can actually think about working with a whole range of different stakeholders, and the conversation about NGOs earlier on this morning, I think, highlighted this nicely, that actually people are involved in this policy process in a variety of different ways, and if you want to be engaged in that from a research perspective, you can look at that in the whole and think about who to engage with. And for us, of course, we engage with a range of departments, from the DFE to DSIT, BAYS previously, to DEFRA as well. But we also look at different organisations that have the ear of government and are able to feed particular perspectives both into the conversation, but also feed our perspective into the policy-making process. So I think that's a key part of our understanding of policy. It's a cyclical process, but that feeds into then our theory of change, theory of policy change. And of course, this means working, as I said, with multiple policy actors, but also taking a cooperative and collaborative and co-constructive approach, as is done here, as is highlighted by a lot of the conversations that have happened thus far. But again, that doesn't necessarily need to be with core central policymakers. It can be co-constructive with a a whole range of different policy actors at different levels to ensure that conversation is iterative and ongoing. But the second key part of, I think, our theory of policy change relates to another point that was raised this morning, which is the relationship between specificity and developing a general program of work, a general research agenda that feeds into maybe a normative approach to policymaking. And I think that's the benefit of a research centre, that you're not just made up of individual disparate projects. There's something bigger. There's a bigger agenda that you can develop over time. So that's the second key part of our theory of change is trying to manage the relationship between active, proactive response, but then bringing that together for a longer agenda that perhaps doesn't have an open policy window anytime soon, but that it's there, you're building a body of work that hopefully at some point in the nearish future, you'll be able to work with different policymakers in implementing that. I think the final part of the theory of change that I just want to highlight is the importance of narrative and storytelling. A while ago, I ended up doing a large piece of work with about a third of CEOs and chairs of the FTSE 100, and really talking about the ways in which business works and the ways in the sort of different skills that are needed within the business context. But really what came out of that was that in any sector, in any context, what's really important to drive change is having a good story to tell. And having a profound narrative that's useful is, I think, really important in a policy context and in driving change. So those are the kind of the key points I wanted to make in terms of our theory of change around policy. I'm probably running out of time, but I'll quickly go through some challenges that I think are worth drawing out from the experiences here. The first one, I think, is about people. It's about the challenge, the difficulty of developing institutional relationships with different policy actors that exist at the level of institution rather than the level of individual researchers. Because so often researchers move, but people, I think, are too prone to hoarding their political capital and really sort of attaching that relationship with a policymaker or a policy actor to themselves. And so trying to translate that for longer term policy impact into an institutional relationship rather than an individual relationship is, I think, a significant issue that everyone actually struggles with. The other, I think, big challenge is the limitation of the structure of government. And by this I mean the fact that actually big policy challenges, whether they're environmental or economic, whatever it may be, sit across multiple government departments. And so just for our work, looking at, say, skills for regenerative agriculture, we've done a lot of work with DEFRA on this, but actually that sits within the DFE as well, and it sits within BEIS or DCIT now, and trying to bring those different departments together and work across them can be both practically challenging, but politically challenging as well. So I think that's a really big issue, that the big grand challenges sit across different structures. What else? I think the final point I'll make here in terms of the challenges is about evaluation, long-term evaluation. And it gets to the heart of, I think, the issue of responsive versus a long-term agenda, which is that too often project-based work is really short-term, and we expect impact to happen really, really quickly. And I'm sure you'll find this in Agile, in the sprints, that policy impact is really messy. It's fortuitous, it's happenstance. And that sometimes means making sure that there's an appropriate engine room to grow those policy impacts over a long period of time and have ways of recording and evaluating all of those as well as propagating them, which means sustained funding, which means a long-term business model for a centre to work and work effectively. So if you'll forgive me, I'll take one minute more to talk about, I think, the opportunities that I've seen from what I've heard today, from looking at all the sprints, which are really exciting. And I think, coming from a Department of Education, looking at the skills issue, it's perhaps not surprising that I see loads of opportunities for interdisciplinary working between the work that's going on here and the work that I think is taking place in the Department of Education where I work. I think there's clearly something really exciting to look at substantively in terms of the nexus between education and training and climate science in this policy space. There's loads of opportunities to think through things, from my perspective, in terms of skills, in terms of knowledge. There are discussions about fake news and the implications of that within our education and training systems. All of these are, I think, really, really important and exciting. But I think there's also the opportunity to think carefully and collaboratively across the university and the sector more broadly about cultural change and thinking about profoundly how our research system in this institution does policy work and has policy impact. And so actually coming up collaboratively with a clear theory around changing the culture of institutions like Oxford is also, I think, really exciting and a huge opportunity that comes from the work of this project.
Thanks, James. There's a lot to kind of unpack there, but the connection with our next speaker is so good. I'm going to move swiftly on to Will Pryor, who's our head of engagement at the Oxford Policy Engagement Network, whose whole job is really thinking about this at more of an institutional level. How do we connect the research that we're doing and the researchers with the policy space? So, Will, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I was just saying that I would tick off the things that were left on my notes that hadn't been said, but they've all been said, although we've only used the words serendipity, fortuitous, happenstance, luck. I'm going to come back to luck quite a bit. So I feel a bit like a fish out of water because I am not have I ever been a researcher. 5 years ago, I was, a little bit more than 5 years ago now, a ceasefire mediator in Ukraine. So far removed from this world and these topics. But I remember phoning the most experienced ceasefire mediator I knew, quite convinced, quite wrongly, that everyone was listening to my phone call, and had to say to him that I'd run through all of the ideas that he'd ever shared with me, and none of them seemed to work, and it all seemed to be a big mess. And I don't know if anyone else saw a connection between that and the creation of this role and my appointment to it, but you mentioned mess like many, many times, and I think that the messiness is one of the big challenges, but an appreciation of the fact that it is a mess. And he said, as he said to me, on the positive side, the fact that you see it as a mess means you probably understand it correctly. And I think that I've carried that with me through some of what is kind of visibly organized here, but is in fact still quite messy. And I think Catherine also talked about the messiness. So very briefly about this mysterious network called Open, which I came to interview, and Open didn't exist, but I didn't know it didn't exist. It made for a very awkward interview. It does now exist. So in July 2020, we launched it. There are now 900 and something members. Our network coordinator is at the back of the room, but I won't test you now. I think it's 900 and something researchers and professional support staff, doctoral students from more than 50 faculties. One of the reasons that I think this role was created and the idea of Open seeded was that, as Catherine was pointing out, lots of other universities were getting busy creating teams to support policy engagement. And did we need to do that, or were we really good at this stuff and we didn't really need such a team? And our team is a kind of experiment to try and find out what it is that researchers want. So we have been doing a bit of navigating by judgment, looking across at our peers at other universities, trying to think of ideas as to what might be useful. So the core functions of our team at the moment are to channel, encourage applications for internal funding for policy engagement, to catalyse that engagement and administer those awards, because somebody's got to do it, and offer ongoing support to award holders. So some of you might have heard of the Public Policy Challenge Fund, which is a creation of our team. Open fellowships have been around since before the network existed. There's a seed fund that offers smaller awards. Very broad brush at the moment. I think we have, I'm not sure how many awards in play, but we have partnerships with local, county and district councils, with 3 or 4 government departments, several NGOs, UK Parliament, and other partners outside the UK in Brazil, Greece, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Pakistan, I think, either awarded and not started or now in process. We also support implementation of strategic initiatives at departmental level through something called a leaders scheme. We share learning and development opportunities and resources. And I think I'm going to focus just on one rather mundane function of what our team does in terms of socializing opportunities for policy engagement. We have a strategy, it's going to be refreshed, so we'll be drawing from what James is alluding to in terms of refreshing it and thinking about what are those cultural changes we want to see. But part of it is making sure that people are aware of those opportunities and they are not retained along with the political capital of one's political contacts. We live in a country where there are more and more formal opportunities for people to engage. So part of the role of our team is to make sure that those are widely socialized and anyone who wants to take them up can take them up. There are a few other things I could talk about team's function, but I just wanted to try and get onto the challenges, see what, if anything, is left of the things that I thought we might talk about. I think, predictably, I'm going to talk about the idea of open-mindedness and what might open-mindedness look like in the years ahead. I asked a question of Catherine earlier about reciprocity and sort of symmetry, and are there things that we can learn about the way policymakers try and engage with us that might give us ideas about how to better engage with them. And she mentioned, I think it was in 2019 when they did a science capability review, they set themselves a target of 50% of fast streamers from a STEM background. Now, that might be a good idea or not a good idea, but I thought it showed some intent, and it's a target that they've already passed in 3 years. And so I think one of the challenges we have, whether or not it's in the context of something like Agile or in different modes and formats and contexts of engagement, is to bring more policy thinking into research. And I think there's a few ways we can do that. One of the ways we already do is through training. So we have an e-learning package. Some of you might have discovered it. It's on our web pages, but I don't have any slides, so you'll have to Google it. But it's actually not used as much as I would like it to be. That gives you the kind of primer on what's the difference between government and parliament and what are the different modes of engagement, etc. Hands-on experience, and I think that's actually one of the main rationales for providing some of this internal funding. It is, of course, to enable researchers and their policy partners to collaborate effectively, but it's also for them both to learn, and then something that we're only just beginning to get better at is to, and we've recruited someone to our team to help us with that, to unlock what they've learned and share it with other people. So I think that's the hands-on experience. And then there's something which I don't have a better term for than hands-off experience. And one of the things we've done in this area, but I'd like to think of what other things might be done, is a peer mentoring scheme where we match civil servants and policymakers at the same career stage, not to have impact on each other and collaborate, but actually just to share some contextual knowledge that they have about the constraints under which they operate, because it's too expensive to enter into those relationships not really understanding it, and yet already trying to have influence, or as we euphemistically call it, impact, that we don't actually know what world they inhabit often. Now, there are lots of exceptions to that, but I think this this kind of hands-off, making it normal for policymakers. Catherine actually made a good point in conversation. We sometimes talk in our team about the idea of two communities divided by a common language. Is that something that we in academia perpetuate? And actually there is just one single community. That's definitely the premise of the peer mentoring scheme, that there's just one community. So I think including them in a way that would seem natural. If I was the head of public engagement, we wouldn't do things that didn't involve the community. And we still do some things. So I'm trying to set as a kind of default mode the involvement of policymakers, whether that be in training or in collaborative projects or in peer mentoring or anything else. And I think, notwithstanding Catherine's reservations about the top tips, I do think that for helping researchers understand as early as possible about different policy contexts, different processes, different dynamics, different things like sprints and not sprints, different ways, to Catherine's area of expertise, the different sorts of evidence and expertise that are valued, and the way values are applied in using them. And just not to develop just knowledge of these, but a kind of wisdom that comes from day-to-day interaction with people, sometimes not with a sharp focus and sometimes with a very sharp focus. Yeah, I've written here, policymaking is too important to be left to policymakers. I think that's what, that somehow runs through some of the ideas that we're experimenting with. The second idea, and I will be very brief on it because I don't have much to say on it, but taking an idea from policy. A while ago, I think probably 10 years ago, the DFE had developed these policy tests, and one of the policy tests that they would ask themselves is, who made you the expert? And I think that is something, I think Anna Palmer said before about how, as researchers, we, or you at least, are experts. But I think the question, deeper understanding of what our expertise is and what the limits are. And we had an event in here where we talked about the nature of expertise for public policy, sitting here. And I think, I can't remember if it was a speaker or someone in the audience said that, drew this distinction between content and context expertise. And I think that too much of the policy engagement that I've been familiar with, at least, is content oriented. And going back to this question about inclusion, I don't find it easy to conceptualize this, and I think it's difficult for researchers and policymakers for different reasons to think about how do we create a context in which these other voices can be heard and on which the success and feasibility of a policy will in any case depend. I don't think I have much more to add, and maybe we don't have time. So.
Brilliant. No, I think there's lots to unpack.
I wish I knew some of the answers to those things, but maybe somebody here does.
Great. Thanks, Will. I mean, I think it's been really interesting to hear across the panel the kind of more individual perspectives to the organisational, the systemic kind of ways of approaching this, and then kind of what Oxford in particular are doing, and this re-emphasis, I think, helpful as we kind of go back into the discussion, kind of re-emphasis on the messiness of this process, the serendipity involved, the randomness sometimes of how these things work, and the kind of idea that this is as much an art as it is a science, where there's a lot of science that's being done on this. So, and this kind of idea that we're kind of being craftsmen and women in this space is really, really helpful. So I think we'll take a quick round of kind of fishbowl just to get us used to the idea, and then we'll go take a coffee break and then come back and kind of generate another discussion after coffee. So just looking for someone to be brave, to be the first person to come up and share their question. It could be on any of these topics, and it'd be interesting to see kind of where the room is feeling with respect to the whole range of issues that have been flagged. Now, just come up and sit on the stage and grab a microphone. Welcome, come. Super. And then if you have another question, just come and plonk yourself down on the front, and catch an eye, and we'll hopefully get a bit of a rotation going.
I've come here as a complete outsider. I'm a retired farmer, and I listened with interest to the first speaker here. who was saying that they're wholly looking at methane emissions in livestock and the effect this has on emissions from the agricultural sector. And my argument would be that there have always been a large amount of ruminants on the planet. Methane has a relatively short life of about 20 or 30 years in the atmosphere, but it totally disregards the other emissions, which are carbon dioxide from all the inputs that are currently used in agriculture in the shape of fertilizer and fuel and transport. So that's where I'm at.
Super. Well, I think you can, it's a really good question. There's a lot to be said. I wonder whether, you can definitely have a quick response, John, but I think whether to reframe the question in terms of maybe this science kind of policy space, there's a lot of issues that are quite contentious. People feel very strongly about them. And I wonder if you could also offer, like in your case, I'm sure you have lots of people asking all kinds of questions and there's strong views around the ways in which methane should be treated, etc. How do you, as a researcher, navigate that kind of, both within the policy space, but also in the kind of public discourse to the extent that you have?
Maybe catch me outside, because I've been working on biogenic methane for about 5 years, so we can have a very extended conversation. I think, this challenge of how do we value methane against carbon dioxide is very contingent on both the physics but also the value framing. And one of the interesting but challenging opportunities with my mini sprint in terms of the legislation in Northern Ireland is partly because how these discussions have spun off and taken life of their own has prompted this to be recognised explicitly in the text of the agreement, that it has to, I can't remember the exact wording, but it has to recognise the kind of specific qualities of biogenic methane. And on the one side of that, you have the fact that, yes, it does break down quickly, and there was some probably much lower level of natural ruminant methane emissions, of which livestock is, some of that is maybe a displacement, but almost, well, we don't entirely know is one of the challenges. But then on the practical side, it's also
Numbers of buffaloes on the Great Plains of the United States were higher than the numbers of bovines now, I think.
I'm not sure about bovines overall. I think that there's been a large increase is the consensus understanding, although in some areas there have been massive declines. But there's also the question of, well, even if that was the case, is that an inherent justification for maintaining the human managed and the level of bovine livestock that we are directly responsible for? And I don't think there is a natural science answer to that. What I have been trying to do through previous work, through ongoing work on the sprint, lots of discussion pieces with Tara through table, is to try and illuminate how there's a kind of reasonably straightforward physical science understanding. We know how methane works, we know how carbon dioxide works, and we know what that means for temperature under different emission pathways. But that can only take you so far of the way in formulating fair and sustainable policies. So through the natural science side of what I'm doing on the sprint, we can illuminate the temperature implications of maintaining or decreasing methane emissions, and the physics is kind of the same whether it's peatland or ruminants burping it out. But then what that means for fair share of mitigation effort across different parts of society, across different sectors, is something where I will have views, but I don't think it's up to me to make that decision. And in terms of the bigger framing, in terms of what a program like Agile or any policy-focused research program can point towards, I think it is important that even as researchers, if we might view ourselves as a bit more narrowly on the science side, that we are aware that they have these social ramifications, and then there is this broader context that we want to be as impartial and science-driven as we can, but we'd be lying if we said that that was it, and the decision is purely evidence-based, based on the physics. But I can expand on some of the wider agricultural sustainability points after, if you'd like.
That's great. Thanks, John. Yes, Tara.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I have two sort of related questions that have been sort of alluded to anyway, but one is that in developing research for policy, you are inevitably doing things that policymakers think are interesting and useful, and of course there are lots of things that they really ought to be interested and concerned in, but they're not. So how do we get research that is out there, I hate to use this cliche, but they're kind of paradigms, and get them to see that this is useful. And then a second point, which is sort of connected to this, I get and I understand and I do the kind of engaging with different stakeholders. But speaking from personal experience, if I go and talk to industry, or if I go and talk to people in government or in NGOs, I always end up sort of empathizing with them, feeling a bit sorry for them, understanding how difficult it is for them. And sometimes you can kind of get lost in that, and suddenly you're starting to feel sorry for, I don't know, somebody who works in Nestle. And you think, well, really, we need to kind of also maintain a kind of, so it is just that, how do you build relationships while also seeing the bigger picture and saying, look, what you're doing there is not good, or it is leading you down a certain path. So I guess that's the question of, do you get too caught up in their concerns and you fail to see more important things, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I have my own views, and maybe we'll come back. I don't know if any of the other panelists have a view on that kind of tension. I guess it's like, the extent to which we're in the service of the government policymakers, and to what extent can we be playing a role, maybe in holding them accountable and changing the conversation, setting agendas, etc.
Yeah, I'll say something to start off with. I think that point is really, really important. And actually talking overtly about how you can be a critical friend in the policy process, rather than just simply providing answers to somebody's questions is essential. And I don't think it's just companies or organizations that we might disagree with or want to hold to account. I think it's governments as well, and being really clear that actually a policy question might be premised on something profoundly wrong that we completely disagree with. And then it's the question of, well, how do you get to that sort of conversation? Now, I don't think, clearly there's no answer. There's no easy answer, obviously. But I think an example from my own work, it probably doesn't resonate with many people, but it's about the way in which education training systems are coordinated by central government. So in England, we operate a very much market-based approach. So organisations are in competition with each other. And that's something that personally I disagree with, and I think the evidence shows that it's not the right way to coordinate systems, or at least education and training systems. And we really struggled to have meaningful conversations about that coordination problem with England's DFE. But we've had really good conversations with Scotland and with Wales about shifting that coordination issue. And I think because of that, by taking a circular route, we've been able to then start having meaningful conversations with the DFE several years later about that issue. So I think, you have to play it by ear, but don't be afraid to be critical. Yeah.
Thanks. Will?
I think you explained the problem much better than I was trying to. I think that this is a good example of, it's kind of a life's work. So you want to be getting into those kinds of situations as early as you can in order to figure out how you feel about all of those things and accept the fact that there isn't a right way of doing it in any context, and only through having them with an individual who has not only their vocational values and their professional interests and what happened over breakfast this morning, you begin to figure out how you are happiest, most comfortable, and most valuable. And I think that it's desperately sad that often that opportunity, the Overton window, suddenly hovers over you at a stage in your career where, for perfectly decent reasons, you've not made it your business to try and figure that out. So I think that's what I meant about bringing more political mindedness, whatever it we called, into research, so that you have that experience. I was going to say something about being kind, but I think we're also having to assume the best of the people that we're talking to.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. I think I've lots of thoughts on that question, but I think this idea that I think I'm already good to go here. So, there's no right answer, and multiple ways of doing that, and it will look different for different people, how they're comfortable in terms of maybe pushing the boundary on that. But in terms of like longer term projects, what I think it would be really nice to see us kind of collectively kind of doing is kind of developing cohorts of researchers that are really aware of the stakes that they're involved with and the kind of ways in which their work can and probably will be co-opted, and maybe developing. I don't think it's that well articulated. I don't think we have discussions about how to resist that co-option, and so kind of having a more politically aware set of researchers that understand the context in which they're working. Everyone's going to take their own different view on how to kind of engage with questions of equity and inclusion in their own way, and it might mean kind of being on the inside, so working very closely with government or corporations. It might be more of an activist or kind of role, and I think that's right. We need a whole range of different approaches, but it'd be nice, I think, to have more and more researchers aware of the kind of their role in the political and policy system, and able to be a bit more reflective about the ways in which their work gets used or might be being used to try and, I guess, resist this kind of greenwashing co-opting that does go on. So we'll take a break for coffee. We're going to come back and just carry on this discussion. So while you're having coffee, I spoke to a few people earlier, and they're like, oh, it's always difficult when you transition to Q&A. It takes me a bit of time to kind of absorb what I've heard and formulate my thoughts and things. So no excuses. You've got coffee now to go away and think about it, formulate some questions, and then we'll carry on with this idea for a short period of time while there's energy, and then Nat's going to offer some wrap up before we have our reception. So we'll take a coffee break for about 20 minutes. We'll be back in here about 10 to 4 for another 20 minutes or 30 minutes of conversation. But thank you very much, and thanks to our panelists. Hopefully you're kind of recaffeinated, ready to kind of dive in. I think we're coming into land in terms of what we're doing today, but it'd be nice, I guess, just to have a chance to take stock. Any last burning questions, any last points that people want to make, anything kind of, particularly if people have got ideas around how we might move forward, practical suggestions either for Agile or for people working in this space. Be really welcome to hear those or to have reflections on that. So it'd be great to welcome the panelists back up. We'll have our hot seat as well available. So change the order. Excellent.
I just wanted to pick up on that point you made earlier, James, about narrative and storytelling and the importance of that in terms of making change happen. And I just wondered if maybe anybody on the panel wanted to share an example where narrative and storytelling was helpful in convincing people.
Brilliant, thank you. James, I'll give you the first refusal.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think the importance of telling a story is critical, and perhaps it comes easier to humanities and social sciences. I think we can link those narrative skills quite overtly with those kinds of disciplines. But ultimately, what matters to telling a story is having data as well. And you know, I'll first of all talk about how that came out through the work that I did. So in terms of looking at narrative within business, and okay, that might be a difficult word, but actually that permeates a whole range of different spaces. Selling a story relates to just selling a set of accounts. So making sure that the data behind the accounts is clear, is overt, but that there's a clear and compelling narrative that actually brings people in. And that there are a whole range of ways that you can unpack a story and look at sort of flow and structural dynamics, make sure there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. All of these aspects are, I think, really, really key to the formulation of an important story. But there's also jeopardy, things like that, that really, really engage the listener and bring them into whatever the message is that's being sold. Now, in terms of sort of policy contexts, I think, actually, let's bring up the idea of climate change education, which is something, that we're involved in terms of the education and training for the Climate Hub. I think there's a lot of discussion about why people should be doing climate change education, and for me, I think the narrative hasn't always been very clear, and it's really easy to slip into just sort of responsibilizing young people for the climate crisis if you just talk about what young people need to do in terms of recycling and so on and so forth. But I think there's a much stronger and interesting narrative around climate change education, empowering young people to be change agents through a whole range of issues, but particularly as economic change agents. So climate change education can be about empowering young people to think about future livelihood, think about their role within a transformed economy, and think about the kinds of skills that are required for that. And I think, and I would like to hope, that that kind of narrative and the formulation of the need for climate change education in those terms has enough power, jeopardy, clear sort of approach that is having some impact now within policy contexts, and shifting the dial from, let's talk about sort of pedagogy and curriculum, so let's talk about grand transformational issues and structural change.
Super. Any other thoughts? I have a question around the relationship between the importance of narratives and storytelling and questions around trust within the kind of science policy networks, I guess, nexus. Because trust has been one of the things that came up a couple of times, came up on the panel quite strongly earlier, and I always slightly worry about an emphasis on, like you said, that it has to be underpinned by good data, but how do we, or putting myself in the shoes of someone who's not a researcher, how do I evaluate the stories that are being told? Or a young person, how do I evaluate the stories that are being told? Particularly if they're kind of dressed up as though here's a story about our research, and then I don't know if you have any reflections on that relationship between how do we use stories to engage and communicate, but also how do we communicate in ways which build trust, or how do we build relationships that kind of generate trust rather than generate mistrust with all the variety of people that researchers and policymakers are engaged with in their work? John?
I don't think I can really give you an answer, but it does strike me that it comes back to, actually I liked what you were saying earlier about needing to, but also presenting opportunities for early career researchers, even kind of PhD level or maybe even before, to be a bit reflective about how their research is taken up and digested. And I think for me at least, kind of a decade ago when I was doing my PhD, there was some science communication training, but I think it was sort of an hour across 3.5 years of a PhD, and it's only through doing postdocs and speaking to policymakers, having events where you've got government departments reflected in the room discussing your research, that I really became attuned to how critical these ways of presenting it are. I think since then, most of the PhD programs have got a bit better at integrating the researchers and the end users, but I think pushing even more on that and having it in mind for something researchers do as early as possible will help resolve some of these things.
For sure. Thanks.
Before Izzy goes, just on this issue of trust, I think it might be worth bringing you into the conversation because you're involved in some research in India, looking at teachers' use of information on climate change and so on and so forth. So it's not just young people who have to navigate a whole range of information. It's teachers who have to navigate it. And you're probably better at talking about this.
Well, I'm trying to now. Yeah, I think definitely that work was with our colleague Steve as well, who was here this morning. And I think we definitely realised through that process how much pressure teachers are under and how, they're really expected to kind of, by the students and by the parents of the students and by the leadership of the school, each kind of group that they're party to expects them to take a different stance. And that, is exhausting. And there's definitely a need for greater professional care and development for teachers as they navigate that journey. And we had a really interesting workshop. Were you that workshop, James? The one we had with people from across the university about how to better support teachers. And there was a lot of talk, because I think some of the teachers who came to that were very focused on the idea of understanding the science better. That's another theme which I guess we already talked a bit about, in terms of a lot of the teachers felt they didn't have the kind of scientific background to necessarily understand some of the more complex systems there. But then we were kind of pointing out that that's not necessarily always the only thing that needs to be addressed. It's a lot of the other teachers in the room were saying that they feel much more concerned about the political side. So it was definitely a tension there, and I think that's something that going forward we're hoping we can work more on in terms of supporting teachers there.
Can I ask a question about the question? What was behind the question about storytelling? Who are we telling these stories to?
I guess I'm just interested in, I guess I was asking it because I'm interested in how we actually make change happen, and I think stories are obviously one of the best ways to actually get people to listen, to care about anything.
So I suppose the answer depends a lot on who you're telling the story to.
Yeah.
So if you're in a room with a super senior person who has 2 minutes, your story will be one kind of story. If you're talking, I tend to think that it's preferable to be in a slightly bigger group with people who will, if you help them understand, going to this point about trust, I feel like that actually quite a lot of, I wish I could give you lots of numbers on this, but I feel like academia has lost a lot of trust, and government has lost a lot of trust, or some, and needs to regain it. And I think that storytelling can be part of that. But if we don't explain what evidence we are thinking about and what evidence, aside from the research evidence, are we talking about when we talk about these decisions that will impact on your lives, I think it's good to, if we can set out that information, other people can make stories out of this. Some of them will make stories that we don't like or we think are misleading stories, but at least those stories will have a kind of foundation of evidence and come from some kind of expertise. Otherwise, I think that story will probably crumble. So I think it's a kind of broad-based story is a good story.
Brilliant. One of the threads, the seat's free for people to come and jump in if they want me to shut up. So, but one of the threads that I think I'd be interested in the panel's views on is this idea of the ways in which values play into these sets of relationships, and how do, I think it also ties into that question of trust and the kind of related ideas around transparency in this space, like being transparent around the ways in which we're communicating our evidence and the ways in which we're kind of drawing in our kind of value systems and combining that with the kind of evidence that we have to create these stories or whatever it is, however it is we're communicating our work. And there has been a lot of kind of talk about how do we kind of understand and communicate these values. I don't know whether you have any views on the extent to which it's kind of should be seen as something that is kind of appropriate to be off stage, as it were, or whether it's incumbent upon those of us in this space to be more transparent about our values and the way in which they shape the stories that we tell, the questions that we ask, the ways in which we do our research. Yeah. You're holding the microphone, James. So.
That's only because I didn't put it down. I think that's a really good question, and it gets to the heart of, I think, research culture, the extent to which organizations, centers, whatever it may be, projects, are engaged in centralizing value and their own values and our own values within the process. What do we call this? Our axiology, right? And yeah, I'm strongly of the view that all research should be value-led and value-based. But this comes to I think the previous discussion about how we can be a critical friend to different organizations, be they policymakers, businesses, whatever it may be. And in order to do that, we don't just need to be value-led, but we need to understand our own values, what they are. And that, I think, can actually be quite tricky if the structure of a research project is based on short-term funding, reactive funding, quick cycle of research staff. All of these issues, I think, prevent people from sitting back and saying, well, yeah, as a community, what are our values on this place? That, I think, requires having a longer-term agenda, space to reflect, space to engage with the evidence that you're sort of dealing with. All of these things, that's not always easy, and that's not always available to a lot of people and a lot of organizations. I think clearly Agile is in a very, very unique space here to be able to do that, and other centers, other organizations like Hermes are in a very good place to actually do that as well. But I think it's really imperative that we foreground our values and make sure that they're overt and shared by everybody involved in various research projects, so they can then be translated into being critical friends and having those policy conversations.
Yeah, I think it's increasingly recognized even among kind of science communities in inverted commas that you can't really do any completely value neutral research, and it's good that there's increasing acknowledgement of that. But I think that's even more pointed when you're trying to do research that has such a direct and close policy ambition as the kind of things we're trying to do in Agile. And it doesn't mean that you can massively change the scope of the project. So with the kind of things I'm doing, that's still fundamentally a natural science project about getting a better handle of what emissions are. But we've tried to be upfront about what some of the broader value implications are about using that knowledge, and implying different land use trajectories will have different social implications, and the kind of benefits and limitations of making those changes, how positive they are, is highly contingent on what you value. And by having these kind of equity concerns upfront, acknowledged, even put out as part of the framing in the proposal, and something we'll return to in how we share that information, I think is essential to have truly fair and sustainable policies that, yeah, they do bring in that science which remains as impartial as we can get it, but that's not the whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a really interesting kind of avenue of work around, particularly with the models, but all work really kind of asking the questions like, to what extent does this tell us anything about, let's say, the equity dynamics or the distributive impacts of various different scenarios? I know in your work you're looking kind of different scenarios or different kind of ways in which to configure land use, quite apart from how you might do that, but like, yeah, what are the kind of equity questions at stake, and to what extent can we shed light on that? And it might be that you say, well, we can't in this program of work, but somehow it's important that we recognize that, so that, because it's often not like an intentional marginalization that goes on, but like somehow like a kind of placing of equity questions is like beyond the scope of this piece of research. And I guess one of the challenges I grapple with is if like it's always beyond the scope of this piece of research, like never gets looked at, and then just perpetuate this kind of sidelining of those kinds of questions. Everyone's like, oh, they're very important questions, but it's beyond what we can do. And if too many people say that, then I think you end up in this kind of problematic dynamic where it's like everyone recognises the value of looking at that, but not to the extent where they actually grapple with it in their own work. So, I mean, I'm not pointing any fingers at all, and if definitely myself as well. If I was going to be pointing fingers, then one of them would at least be at me. So, but just kind of raising that as a challenge, I think, in terms of the ways in which we grapple with these issues.
I'll just add that we've briefly spoken about honest brokers and advocates. I think that going back to your question of trust, I think if, and I say this as a non-researcher, but I think as a researcher, if one is able to, by default, position oneself as an honest broker and explain to yourself in the first instance, test it on yourself, do you convince yourself that you're an honest broker? And then establishing that trust comes from being able to foreground those things and saying, this is the value, the set of values that have shaped my research questions and my research process and my research outputs and my research and potential outcomes that puts you in the best possible position to be in the room when the things that you care about the most are at stake. If everybody knows what you think because you've tweeted about it for 20 years, they're unlikely to need you in a room when they've got to manage the trade-offs between something that hundreds of people have devoted their research to and a completely unrelated field that just happens to be economically completely contingent, where they have to describe to the people who vote for them, if people vote for them, what values they're going to apply to resolve those trade-offs. That's not something as a researcher you need to be concerned about, but I think, well, you will be concerned about it, but it didn't inform the way you did the research necessarily, because it was always beyond the scope of this research.
Yeah.
What does it mean if we pursue the recommendations of this policy brief from the Agile program? What are the trade-offs unrelated to the environment? What are we not going to do that we're now going to have to do? We can't do everything.
Yeah.
And that's chock full of values. So no, I think it's great that people are talking about them more and foregrounding them more, but I think it's a good way of building trust to make them very explicit.
Yeah. So you're saying that kind of being transparent about the assumptions you're making about the scope and the values that are in play,
Well, you asked about values and trust,
Yeah.
so I think particularly in relation to values, being able to say, you're not the first person who's asked me this. Anyone who asks me, I always point them to these 3 core pieces of underpinning research which shape the way we as a discipline think about these topics. But I say that to everybody.
Yeah.
And you're explicitly saying, lots of people consider me to have some expertise in this respect, but also my first move is to signpost you to stuff that is not about, not something that necessarily means you're going to call me again.
Yeah. Okay,
But they would be very likely to call you again because they always think, who's that guy Mark somebody? He always manages to set out that context in a very eloquent, elegant and concise way. He probably knows about this.
Yeah.
Then you have to check in on your values and go, do I really know about it? Or actually is James the person to talk to? So, yeah.
Yeah. Super. Pete, you're going to jump in.
I had a question about the COVID inquiry, because I feel like this is a really unusual situation we're in that every day for my sins, sometimes I drive home, I turn on the radio, and they're dissecting the science policy interface on the news, on radio, every day, this last week particularly, but obviously over a longer period too. So I guess there's a larger question of what do you think is going to flow from that dissection of the science policy interface? What kind of avalanche of change might be coming our way? Because people have said, the end result seems to be it didn't work that well in COVID, and the same problems are going to happen in climate, in biodiversity, in AI, etc. So what things do you think might flow from that? What opportunities might there be in there? What challenges or kind of top-down stuff might there be? And then a kind of secondary question in there is, for me, what I think one of the things that's going to flow from it is there's going to be a huge push that we somehow need to train up researchers to be more politically aware and policy-minded. And how do we do that in a way that's meaningful and not just another course that you sort of are forced to go to, or another electronic course you do when you first start a job or something? Like, how do we do that training in a way that's meaningful, not just a tick box exercise? And the same on the political side. If politicians need to be better at synthesizing and digesting research, like, how do we engage with that in a meaningful way? Do we have any bright ideas about how to do that and it not just be kind of going through the motions, which I think there's a real risk that happens.
Great questions.
Not much to say on it, but I would say that I wouldn't dismiss out of hands the tick box exercises. I genuinely think that requiring people to demonstrate a minimum level of that kind of understanding is a very sensible, it may be a very difficult thing to do, because we have all this academic freedom, which means I don't have to do anything that I don't want to do. But I think I think that would not be a bad thing. If you put yourself in the position of a senior academic who has just landed in a university they don't know, and there's a lockdown, and they need to put together a SWAT team of people who they can talk with in a socially distanced context to thrash something out. You want to know that these people have got that minimum understanding, and they're not going to say, hang on, is it government or is it parliament? And so I think having those resources, encouraging people to use them and incentivizing them to use them, I think is not a bad idea. But I also think by the time I'm even older, I think we'll be able to identify these kind of cycles of enthusiasm for these things, and then a loss of interest, and then a painful lesson learned, and I think it'll come in cycles.
Yeah, John?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, it's hard not to despair a bit at the COVID inquiry. I guess my reflections on it are partly that, well, at the time it was kind of obviously untrue that the government were following the science, as they might have claimed. But I think that's really emerged through the inquiry so far, that even the government scientists were didn't enjoy that being the line that, oh, we're just following the science. And one part of me is a bit nervous that it's like, well, now there isn't going to be scientific credibility for policy in the future. And it's just kind of out the window that we can have some evidence-based policy formation. Hopefully it won't go that way, though. But I hope we can get to a kind of more nuanced understanding of the limits of evidence-based policy, and a better recognition within government of what we can use science for and what we can't, and it won't be kind of the scapegoat or the kind of the shield, as it looks like it was framed a bit during COVID.
I'm a big believer in the simple, messy explanation is better than the kind of all-knowing, manipulating politician explanation. And I think the likes of Boris Johnson genuinely thought and believed it when he said, we're just going to try and follow the science. But he didn't appreciate, and the wider system didn't appreciate, that the science is not going to give you sort of valueless, neutral menu of options, and if this happens, then this happens, and if you do this, then this happens. It's going to give you a set of kind of valued, contextualized things that you're going to then have to digest and do a lot of with. And so I think they believed they could follow the science, and even in that kind of quite narrow semi-medicalized topic of COVID, like, it didn't make sense, and it makes even less sense in an environmental and biodiversity type context, I think.
Yeah, and my hope is that having been through this process now with COVID, there will be a bit more understanding of that, and it would facilitate science-informed policy design in the future.
A good thing would be more movement between research and policy, which I think there were kind of moves in that direction pre-COVID, but I think now there's already some evidence of them wanting to do more of that. Question for ourselves, are we ready for that? Are researchers ready to leave research for a period of time, confident that they'll be welcomed back with their new competencies and new insights?
Yeah, I think one of my reflections as well has been separating out like the kind of political side and the science advice side is tricky. But also I think one of the lessons coming out of the COVID inquiry is the range of expertises that are being drawn upon in that particular moment or to address a particular challenge. Obviously, COVID very different to environment sustainability, but I think the kind of relatively narrow range of kind of voices that were kind of deemed to be kind of in the science advice or to be kind of legitimate science advisors, in hindsight, pointing their fingers, like, but there are a lot of questions about different types of academics or different disciplines that maybe had evidence that could have been drawn into the response and the decision-making processes that weren't. And I think that might be one of the things that comes out of the inquiry is the kind of breadth of expertise that exists in the country. Makes it more complicated, more difficult to navigate in many ways. But that's what the politician's job is, and kind of equipping them with the knowledge across these disciplines have been a kind of key piece of the puzzle for like future work, I think. So, for example, in climate change, going beyond just carbon budgets and carbon dynamics, but bringing in a much more wealth. Not saying that's what happens, but this illustratively. Interdisciplinarity, kind of competencies as well as all these other things is kind of a key piece of it. So on that note, given that it's a kind of key piece of the Agile puzzle, I would like to say thank you again to our panelists. And all the hot seat panelists as well. It was really nice to have you up here.